Hello everyone. We started this series of videos on phenomenology with an event that came to pass in Sartre's life, which kick-started a new chapter in his life. I'm referring to the event in which Raymond Aron introduced Sartre to phenomenology, saying that you can make philosophy with it, pointing towards the glass of apricot cocktail in front of them. After having started talking about Husserl, Heidegger and Frankl, we have completed the full circle and finally come to Sartre. In this video, we will look at how Sartre read Husserl and Heidegger, creating his version of phenomenology. As we have seen previously, Heidegger took the ontological route, and since Being and Time was published before Sartre published Being and Nothingness in 1943, right in the midst of the Second World War, he tried to reconcile the two approaches, that is to say, Husserl's epistemological and scientific approach and Heidegger's ontological approach. And that is precisely what we find in Sartre. We find equal emphasis on both ontology and phenomenology in his writings, as is clear from the subtitle of Being and Nothingness, which reads, An Essay on Ontological Phenomenology. Sartre was not just a philosopher, he was an era of philosophy in himself. He had already made himself known in 1938 with the publication of his groundbreaking novel La Nausée. Then, while Europe was turning red with blood during the Second World War, first Sartre was taken as a prisoner of war in the beginning of the war. This period is known as the Phony War, but during this time, Sartre did not stop philosophizing. Here it must be mentioned that though Sartre became famous first as a writer, then as a philosopher, but before publishing La Nausée, he had already written two important essays, both of them dealing with phenomenology and particularly with Husserl. From 1933 to 1935, he was a research student at the Institut Français in Berlin and Freiburg. During this time, he studied the works of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, which significantly influenced his philosophical development. And returning to France, he wrote the following two essays as a consequence of his stay in Germany. One is called The Transcendence of the Ego, and the other is called Intentionality, the Fundamental Notion in Husserl's Phenomenology. Both of these essays were written in 1936, in which he tries to find out how much he agrees or disagrees with Husserl especially. And this critique of Husserlian phenomenology continued during the Phony War. During his time in the French army and then as a prisoner in 1939-40, Sartre did not stop philosophizing as mentioned. He kept notebooks with him in which he constantly noted down his reflections alongside the daily events passing before his eyes. A part of these notebooks was published with the title War Diaries posthumously, and it is in them Sartre notes down something incredible related to Husserl. He says that Husserl had gripped him from the moment he read him and became a Husserlian, and furthermore longs to remain so. Then finally in 1943, all of his efforts in the domain of phenomenology came to fruition in the form of his tome entitled Being and Nothingness. After this pithy biographical journey, now let's take a philosophical look at these formative years and see what Sartre took from and contributed to phenomenology from these 10 years worth of studies. Since the main thinker with whom Sartre engages the most in his philosophical journey as far as phenomenology is concerned is Husserl, we are going to contrast his approach mostly to that of Husserl, thereby delineating his understanding of phenomenology. And while comparing his approach with Husserl, as a subtext it can be seen how his approach intersects with that of Heidegger or Frankl. As with Heidegger and Frankl, the first thing Sartre addresses is the fundamental task of phenomenology. According to Husserl, the essential task of doing phenomenology is finding out the possible conditions and methodology of a strictly scientific philosophy. When Sartre reads this, he remarks that Husserl is wrong in designating a strictly scientific philosophy as the ultimate objective of phenomenology. Sartre considers Husserl as his master when it comes to phenomenological methodology, but he says that a true phenomenologist who follows this route is actually envisioning a foundation of an ethics and a politics. That is the fundamental task of phenomenological inquiry, unearthing the foundational elements of a system of ethics and politics. Sartrean aims are different from Husserlian aims. Sartre is more concerned about the practical application of phenomenological inquiry. He wants to do philosophy with apricot cocktails, or pears, or wine, or whatever he is drinking. And this is his first concern regarding Husserl's objectives in phenomenology. He thinks that spending volumes and volumes of writings on the foundations of a scientific philosophy dries out the philosopher's energy in impractical epistemological concerns. He considers Husserl to have spent too much time on talking about the conditions of the possibility of experience, which roughly corresponds to Immanuel Kant's epistemological concerns. Though Husserl took a huge step ahead in ascertaining the primacy of the intentionality thesis in doing philosophy, but rather than extending it to practical concerns of life, his work focuses more on making scientific philosophy possible. Notwithstanding Sartre's critique of Husserl's concerns about the ultimate aim of phenomenology, he takes up the oxymoronic task of criticizing Husserl through his own methodology, or as he himself says, that his task is to liberate Husserl from himself. His position is that Husserl's earlier writings, which includes his logical investigations, present better picture of phenomenology than his later writings. Basically, in his earlier writings, Husserl focuses more on intentionality thesis and phenomenological methodology, and in his later writings, after his lifelong contribution to philosophy, he concerns himself more with the question, what is phenomenology for? So, to summarize, it can be said that Sartre mostly, not completely, agrees with earlier Husserlian positions and disagrees with later Husserl writings. Now let's talk about a shared concern between Sartre and Husserl. In phenomenology, the problem of subjectivity and its relationship with objectivity is always on the forefront. And it is not just in phenomenology, but even before, since Descartes' time, this problem has been disturbing philosophers. Husserl's main concern from the get-go is how the intrinsic being of objectivity is presented, apprehended in knowledge, and thus ends up being subjective. Followed by a secondary concern that how is knowledge possible without reducing the phenomenon to psychological process. These two concerns are also present in Sartre, but he does not consider these concerns to be separate from one another. There is one man whose theory is responsible for this mess of confusion, and that is Descartes, according to Sartre. For him, phenomenological understanding of consciousness can liberate the mind from the chains of Cartesian idealism. We have a wrong approach while trying to understand objectivity. We consider objectivity to be a state of analysis in which there is no role of subjectivity. Secondly, we take it for granted that objective analysis aims for a pure formal state of being in which the object is purified and presented as a whole in a go. This is not how we achieve objectivity. Phenomenology provides us the pragmatic way of achieving phenomenology. Firstly, objectivity is irreducible to a particular point of view, and every intentional act has a particular point of view, or we can say that every mental act is perspectival. Therefore, for there to be objectivity, the thinking subject has to establish a relationship between subjectivity and the intended object, and piecemeal chisel the object through phenomenological reduction unless the purest, most objective stage of analysis can be reached. Hence, there is no objectivity without subjectivity. And here comes the Sartrean attack on the Cartesian theory. Since Descartes, consciousness has been understood as a container of mental objects, a theater of the mind, that there is an onlooker behind the mind looking at what we are looking at and entrapped therewith. There is some element of vulgarization involved in this presentation. Descartes did not exactly postulate this, but he is misfortunate that this model of consciousness came to be known as the Cartesian model. The problem with this kind of understanding of the mind is that it becomes almost impossible to establish a concrete relationship between the subject and the object. Since every object becomes in the end its mental representation, which is also called idea, in the mind of the intending subject, and the mind can only access its ideas and nothing else, therefore the material world is almost non-existent in the Cartesian model. In other words, the mind is just playing around with its own self, with its ideas, with mental representations, etc., without disturbing itself much about the objective world. Sartre admires Husserl to have properly identified, explained, and resolved this problem through phenomenology, because intentionality thesis establishes a concrete relationship between the subjectivity of consciousness and the objectivity of the outside world. Or as Sartre says, the intentionality thesis has purified consciousness. Now we know that for there to be cognition, there has to be a consciousness intending an object other than itself and creating an analytic relationship with it, while respecting the difference in their respective modes of being. Consciousness remains subjective, but it transcends its subjectivity with effort to embrace the objective point of view under which an objective aspect of the intending object can be analyzed. According to Sartre, every intentional act of consciousness has a particular questioning attitude that allows for the objective unfolding of the object. It allows for the discovery of the meaning such that any other subject can also agree upon its veracity. Now, we do not have to care about questions like how well is mental representation actually representing the world, or whether it is actually representing the world at all. All these idealistic inquiries start with the mental phenomenon, and it is assumed that somehow the subject can analyze everything about the phenomenon under analysis through his own analytic capacities. This kind of vulgarized Cartesian attitude gives rise to an abhorring attitude towards the reality of the world that does not spin according to their caged ideas. And it is this very attitude that Sartre accuses for having created the theories with which we can only make Alice happy in the Wonderland. He agrees with Husserl that act-transcendent objects are necessary for the possibility of knowledge, because unless there are act-transcendent objects, the process of acquiring knowledge from different perspectival intentional acts will continue, where every act brings up a new point of view and increasing the depth of analysis, while subjectivity does not impose anything of its own volition, but let the intentional object represent itself as best as it can. In other words, the more subjectivity becomes humble and reduces its task to the pure description of the intentional object, the more it comes closer to the true phenomenological spirit and gets away from the Cartesian idealism. Act-transcendent objects basically has one essential property, that the intentional act cannot completely exhaust it. The intentional act is a temporal act with a phase of time during which it contains and establishes a relationship with the intentional object. It cannot by its nature establish a complete, robust relationship with the object within this temporality, because the unfolding of meaning is not a static process. It is a dynamic process requiring multiple intentional acts. To give you a practical example, if I want to know about the atomic properties of water, I will have to keep going back again and again to the lab to observe this H2O from as many different perspectives as possible. I have to use different equipment, and then once I use different equipment, the dimension of the analysis will also change. Therefore, I would have to contrast the findings with naked eye as well. Furthermore, there may be chemical changes and reactions that may help me find out more about it, etc. etc. It is precisely in this sense Sartre wants us to approach the intentional object with the proper questioning attitude. Flip the object, twist it, turn it, give it time, let it speak. Do not impose prejudgments on it. Be ethically concerned about it. Learn from it. In short, as Sartre summarizes it so well in his own words, he says that Husserlian phenomenology understands consciousness as nothing other than relation to the world. So Sartre shook Husserl's hand on the matter of consciousness as an intentional act, fundamentally speaking. But what about the source of this act? Or as Sartre asks, is there a source of this act or not? For Husserl, answering this question became a bit difficult. But he ultimately claims that the ego is the source of intentionality or the subject of consciousness. It must be made clear that this has nothing in common with Freudian ego, nor does it have anything in common with the element of pride with which we usually use this term in our everyday life. It would suffice to say, just for the purpose of simplifying the problem and the concept, that the ego in Sartre and Husserl both is a synonym of the self or the I. I mean the capital letter I, me, or je en français, or moi. I mean, you get the point, I. The ego is the center of gravity in Husserl. It is responsible for synthesizing experience. Even after we do phenomenological reduction on the ego and try to bracket it out from the intentional act, Husserl concedes that all conscious acts are still experienced as emerging from a conscious center. He is not ready to let go of the transcendental, pure ego that is present in each cogito, because the pure ego performs the all-important task of unifying the conscious act. If I am conscious of a leaf, and then I am conscious of a branch, then I am conscious of roots, then I am conscious of stem, then ultimately there has to be a pure ego or a conscious center who comes along during the act and who has the capacity to knit together these different conscious data sets deriving from different intentional acts and create a unified whole that we call a conscious unity of a tree. Unless the ego does not have the capacity of retention and aggregation, there is no possibility of unifying these different conscious data sets. Hence, there is no possibility of experiencing a tree. Apart from retention, the pure ego is also responsible for many other phenomenological tasks, the most important of them being the determination of the mindness of experience. It is not just anyone experiencing the tree. This appearance of the tree is presented to my consciousness. Therefore, this presentation is given to me. This particularity of the mindness derives from the ego. So this is Husserl's position on the pure ego. To summarize, we can say that according to him, every intentional act has three constitutive elements: the activity, the intentional object, and the ego. This kind of consciousness in which the ego personifies the conscious field is also called egological consciousness. Now when Sartre reads this, he dusts off his hands from Husserl at this point. For Sartre, the ego is neither formally nor materially in consciousness. It is outside in the world. Nonetheless, this does not mean that this position collapses into that vulgarized Buddhist conception of the non-self, about which Zizek often talks about, that the world is nothing but a flow of atoms and every act that is done by us is not really done by us because there is no such thing as self. It is all just nothingness floating in the air, permeating the ether and whatnot. Or like Alan Watts claimed following this vulgarized Buddhist philosophy that self-identity is nothing but an intellectual hallucination. Sartre does not say that the self is not part of our conscious experience. He asks the following question to differentiate between his position from that of Husserl's. Is the self, the ego or I, the condition for or the outcome of the conscious experience? And his answer is that consciousness makes I possible, whereas Husserl thinks that the ego is the condition for conscious experience. But then immediately Sartre is presented with the challenge of the unity of consciousness. As we have just seen, that according to Husserl, the ego is primarily responsible for unifying consciousness. In the absence of the ego, Monsieur Sartre, who does this job? He says, il dit, pas de problème, no problem. Firstly, he stresses the fact that it is precisely this ego from which phenomenology purified consciousness. And then Husserl later infused this personified conscious center of gravity back in it, incorrectly. He posits that the unity of conscious act is caused by the thing itself, i.e., the intentional object, as a perceived unity. There is no need, says Sartre, of another intentional act to do this unifying business for us. The intentional structure of the act and the temporal extension of the act are enough to give rise to an immanent unity of conscious experience, almost in a pre-reflective kind of way. So we can say that Sartre posits a non-egological model of consciousness. There is a reason why Sartre wants to empty consciousness of the ego, which we realize when we come to the description of consciousness in his book Being and Nothingness. In L'être l'unia, Sartre says that consciousness is no thing, no thing, thing. So write it together but say it with a pause in between. It is no thing or nothing because, as Heidegger has posited, later also followed by Frankl, while consciousness is intentional, it is also consequently self-transcending. This is what Sartre calls being for itself. Consciousness at each moment is relating itself anew with the world, always filling its emptiness with meaning from the world. Consciousness is non-being or a relation to things which makes every this or that appears. Grâce à la phénoménologie, Sartre can reach this exposition of consciousness. If Husserl would not have presented the intentionality thesis as he did, Sartre would not have been able to free consciousness from the shackles of being in itself of static mental representation of the Cartesian model. In the first chapters of Being and Nothingness, Sartre discusses the questioning attitude which is fundamental to human condition and consequently to human consciousness. And this questioning attitude can only be possible for consciousness if and only if consciousness is intentional and possesses the capacity of self-transcendence. It is not just questioning attitude. From this attitude emerges reflection, which is a particular kind of questioning attitude that consciousness adopts after withdrawing from the surrounding world to leave the level of being and reach non-being with the purpose of transcending its existing state and at the same time announcing its dynamic freedom from the situation of the state of affairs at hand. Our consciousness is transcendent and consequently free. Now perhaps you could better understand why Sartre said that we are condemned to be free. Thank you everyone.